He didn't stand during the pledge, not out of protest, but because his trauma wouldn't let him. Seconds later, a taser dropped him to the floor of a courtroom. No one helped. No one spoke. Until someone recorded it. And the internet erupted. But while the world watched in outrage, 12 Marines did something no one expected. They showed up, not in anger, but in honor. What followed turned a silent moment of pain into a national reckoning. Why did one man's stillness shake? The system. What made 12 Marines walk into that courtroom without saying a word? This is the story that will stay with you. The fluorescent lights above the courtroom buzzed with a dull, steady hummed, too quiet to be a distraction, but loud enough to grate on nerves already pulled taut. Wooden benches creaked as spectators shifted in place, trying to settle into the staleness of justice done by rote. On the far left of the last row, James J.D. Dalton sat alone, hands resting palms down on his thighs, fingers curled slightly inward. He wasn't trying to be defiant. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He just couldn't move. His jaw was locked, not from stubbornness, but from restraint. The kind that only comes from someone used to holding things in breath, pain, fire. His eyes were fixed on the front of the room, not on the flag or the bench or the towering presence of the bailiff by the door, but on something else. Something that wasn't there. Something only he could see. When the bailiff called, "All rise," the room obeyed in a practiced, rustling shuffle of knees and heels and the scrape of wood on tile. Everyone stood. Everyone except J.D. He remained seated. The judge entered black, robe flowing, expression unreadable, and took her place behind the bench. She was mid-50s, efficient, not unkind, but certainly not sentimental. She glanced briefly across the room, her eyes pausing for a split second on the only man who hadn't risen. Her voice, measured and precise, sliced through the silence. "Mr. Dalton, this court expects the respect of standing for the bench." He didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't even blink. A young clerk, clearly newer to this world, shifted in her seat uncomfortably. A few heads turned toward him. The man with the stiff back and buzzed gray hair, the Marine tattoo half visible beneath the rolled cuff of his long-sleeve shirt. No tie. Boots worn, not scuffed. He didn't look angry, just still. Too still. The judge tried again slightly. "Firmer, sir. I'm going to ask you once more to stand as a sign of respect to this court." A muscle twitched in J.D.'s cheek. His right hand, still resting on his leg, gave a subtle tremble. It lasted less than a breath. It's barely noticeable, unless you were looking for it. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. Swallowed. I'm not trying to disrespect the court, Your Honor," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I just can't." The room froze in that kind of awkward, unsure quiet, the kind where no one knows whether to scoff or lean in. The judge furrowed her brow. "Can't or won't, Mr. Dalton?" J.D. looked at her then, finally meeting her eyes. There was no challenge in his gaze. No rebellion, just fatigue. And underneath it, a depth most people in that room would never know. "I served in Fallujah," he said quietly. "3rd Recon. Lost a lot of good men. Got used to ducking when doors opened behind me, my brain. It hears a command, it sees movement, and sometimes it just ... locks up." A murmur rippled through the gallery. One woman near, the front, clutched her purse a little tighter. A man in a suit turned toward him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The judge hesitated. It was a moment she could have let soften. She could have seen the scar beneath the silence. But she didn't. "Disorder in the court is not tolerated," she said. "This is your final warning." J.D. lowered his eyes. It's not in submission. In resignation, he wasn't sure what was more exhausting, trying to explain to people who had never heard mortar fire, or realizing that explaining it changed nothing. From the side, a bailiff began to move. J.D. didn't flinch, because when you've already survived hell, a courtroom doesn't scare you. But it can still break you quietly, piece by piece, with rules written for people who never had to disobey one to stay alive. The judge's gavel landed with a crack that echoed louder than It needed to in the sterile courtroom. Monica Ilwell adjusted her glasses, leveled her gaze across the room, and zeroed in again on the man who had not stood. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice firmer now, edged with something more brittle than irritation. "This court has given you the benefit of the doubt? But if you refuse to comply with the rules of this chamber, you will be held in contempt." JD sat exactly as he had a moment before, hands still on his thighs, feet flat on the floor, shoulders squared not in defiance but in control. He didn't speak right away. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, the words having to travel up through something thick and slow inside him, like trying to yell from the bottom of a well. "Ma'am," he began, carefully. "It's not disrespect. It's not about the court. I've got issues with sudden movements, small spaces." Orders shouted without warning. There was a pause in the room, long enough for one of the court officers to shift his stance and another to glance toward the bench, waiting for the nod. "It's PTSD," JD added, quieter now. "It's like saying the acronym too loud might trigger something. It's real. It's diagnosed. I'm not making excuses. I need to stay seated." Judge Ilwell didn't respond immediately. Her face didn't move. She studied him with the careful calculation of someone used to parsing truth from excuse, fact from performance. But she wasn't a combat veteran. She wasn't even married to one. She'd never heard the sound of mortar fire in her sleep or flinched at a slamming door. She had spent her career in marble-floored halls and well-lit chambers where authority was asserted with posture and protocol, and respect was a standing gesture, measurable, visible, unquestioned. "Mr. Dalton," she said finally, voice tight, clipped, "you do not dictate the terms of your behavior in this courtroom. You will rise when I enter. That is the rule. Period." A wave of heat rose in JD's chest, not engurges the kind of rising anxiety that always came right before. The worst happened. He could feel the air closing in, like the walls were inching forward, pushing the floor upward. He'd trained for close-quarters combat. But not for this kind-off confrontation, where the enemy wasn't a man with a rifle, but a system with a blindfold and a gavel. "I can't," he said again. "I'm not trying to be a problem. Just let me sit, please." The judge leaned back, exhaled through her nose, and nodded toward the bailiff. "Take him into custody." There was a pause, half a second of disbelief before two bailiffs approached. Their boots clapped across the tile floor, each step measured, methodical, like everything else in that room. JD flinched at the first sound of motion behind him. He didn't mean to. It was instinct, pure and sharp and deeply wired into muscle memory, the kind that had saved his life more than once, and now betrayed him in public. "Hands where we can see them," the taller bailiff barked. JD obeyed. Instantly. Hands up, palms out. He wasn't fighting, wasn't resisting, could barely breathe. The sound of footsteps, the shift of energy behind him, it all pulled him straight back. Dark rooms. Muzzle flashes, the metallic temps of fear in the air. Turn. Around came the next command. He didn't move, not out of resistance, but paralysis. His jaw clenched tight. His body froze. His ears rang. One of the bailiffs muttered something into a radio. The other placed a hand on his shoulder and jerked it slightly. That's when JD's breath caught. That's when his mind screamed, "Move." Even as his body locked tighter. A split-second decision. A snap. A shock. The taser deployed with a hollow pop. Electrodes connected. JD jerked backward, crashing off the bench and landing hard on the floor, muscles convulsing beneath his shirt. A gasp rushed through the courtroom. Someone stifled a shout. Someone else hit record. He lay there, twitching, trying not to cry out, trying to breathe, trying to remember what country he was in, what room, what year. One of the bailiffs shouted commands he couldn't process. The judge watched from above, mouth set, hands folded. Neatly before her, and somewhere in the back of the room, a woman slipped out silently, phone already pressed to her ear. She knew someone who would care, someone who wouldn't let this pass quietly, because she understood something. His courtroom didn't. JD didn't. Refused to stand out of pride. He stayed seated out of survival. The sharp crack of the taser rang out louder than the gavel ever had. It pierced the hushed courtroom with an unnatural violence, a sound out of place in a room built for order and decorum. For a split second, everyone froze, caught between disbelief and shock watching, as J.D. Dalton's body seized in the air and slammed to the ground like a felled tree. His limbs convulsed once. Then again, the current forcing his muscles into cruel, rigid motion before releasing them all at once. He hit the floor hard, the thud reverberating under the benches, echoing through the souls of every person who sat there pretending this was just another day in court. Then, silence. His back arched once more in a residual spasm before he stilled. Completely, eyes fluttering, chest heaving, his face twisted not in rage, but in raw confusion. As if his body had betrayed him in front of people he never wanted to see him weak. He didn't scream, didn't curse, just blinked up at the fluorescent ceiling, dazed and trembling. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. It wasn't outrage, not yet. It was disbelief, hesitation, the collective murmur of a crowd not sure whether they were witnessing justice or something far uglier. No one moved to help him. No one shouted for medical aid. They just watched. Some instinctively reached for their phones, recording like reflex, like it was their duty to capture the moment rather than respond to it. Little red lights blinked in every corner of the room. The glow of a dozen screens cast a strange pallor across the wooden pews. The bailiffs hovered over J.D., their expressions a mix of protocol and discomfort. One of them holstered the spent taser. The other reached for cuffs. Neither made eye contact with him. He lay there still, trying to breathe, trying to understand how following his instincts, staying seated to avoid a full-blown panic had just made him a threat. The judge remained still behind the bench, her face tight, unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't ask if he was okay. Maybe she thought asking would imply fault. Maybe she believed none existed. She folded her hands and looked on, and then someone stood. She didn't gasp, didn't shout, just rose from her seat in the middle row, quietly, steadily, and stepped out into the aisle. She was in her 40s, maybe early 50s, sharp eyes, gray streaks in her braid. She moved with a deliberate grace like she'd once marched, but had long since traded salutes for silence. No. One tried to stop her as she walked down the aisle and toward the rear of the courtroom. The bailiffs were still preoccupied. The judge didn't notice. The audience didn't care. Outside in the hallway, she pulled a phone from her coat pocket. It's an old one taped along the side, the screen slightly cracked near the top. She unlocked it, her fingers moving with certainty. Muscle memory that hadn't been used in years. She hesitated for just a moment, her thumb hovering over a name. Then she tapped it. It rang once, then twice. Then a voice, familiar and clipped, answered on the other end. "Command Ops, identify." "It's me," she said, her voice steady, clear. "You're going to want to see something. It just happened in Branch County Superior Court. You're going to want the colonel. You're going to want to send someone fast." There was a pause. Then, "Copy that." She ended the call. In the courtroom behind her, J.D. still lay on the floor, groaning softly as the cuffs clicked. Around his wrists, the woman slid the phone back into her coat and began walking toward the exit. Her stride was calm, but her eyes, they were already on fire. By the time J.D. Dalton was dragged to his feet, wrists bound and shirt damp with sweat. The video had already hit the internet. Someone in the courtroom, maybe a law student with fast thumbs or a retiree who'd been scrolling news feeds during jury selection, had captured the exact moment his body jolted from the taser's current. They caught the silence before it, the flinch of his shoulders, a slight shake in his voice when he said, "Please, I just can't." They recorded the bailiff's approach, the tension in the air like an invisible string snapping, and then the pop, the fall. The stillness, it was all there, framed in the too close. Clarity of a smartphone held at just the right angle. The caption beneath the video was short and devastating. "This man is a Marine. He was tased for not standing fast enough in court." Within 10 minutes, it was reshared 100 times. In 30 minutes, it had crossed state lines, jumping platforms, stitched into 1,000 reaction clips. By the time JD reached the holding cell, barely able to sit upright without wincing, the story had left the courtroom far behind. It was no longer about Branch County. It wasn't even about a courtroom. It was about something deeper, an open nerve inside the American conscience. A veteran brought low, not by combat, but by protocol. Not by enemy fire, but by bureaucracy. Some viewers were furious, or others were confused. Most just watched in stunned silence, wondering how it came to this. Comment sections lit up words like disgraceful, inhumane, and un-American, flooding timelines that only hours earlier had been filled with weather reports. And cat videos, but miles away, in a modest one-bedroom apartment just outside Quantico, one man watched with something colder than fury. He watched it in complete stillness. Staff Sergeant Emilio Torres sat at his kitchen table, phone in one hand, mug of untouched coffee in the other. The video had been forwarded to him by a friend from his old unit. No caption, no context, just the clip. It started mid-motion. The bailiff's hand already reaching, JD's shoulders locked in place. Emilio didn't flinch when the taser fired. He didn't pause when JD hit the floor. He didn't even blink. He watched it twice, then a third time, slower. He didn't need the backstory. He already knew it. He knew the way your body forgets how to respond to normal commands. Knew the way a simple directive stand-up could. Trigger a battlefield memory that didn't ask for permission before crashing into your brain. He knew the look in JD's eyes, too, the kind that came not from guilt, but from the exhaustion of trying to explain yourself to people who thought trauma had an on-off switch. Emilio reached for a notepad, scribbled down the court name from the video's tag, then pushed back from the table. He moved through his small apartment with a quiet urgency, grabbing his keys, checking his wallet, tugging a jacket from the hook by the door. Before stepping out, he opened the group chat he hadn't touched in months. Recon ghosts say. Ragtag collection of Marines who still called each other brother, even when they hadn't spoken in a year. He dropped the video in with 2 words. He's one of us. 3 dots blinked immediately in response. Then, where? What happened? Tell me this is a bad joke. He didn't answer. Not yet. There were calls to make first. Emails to dig up. Some people would need convincing. Others wouldn't. Need a single word? Just the video and a time to show up. Because for Emilio Torres, this wasn't a viral moment. It was a mission briefing. The holding cell was small, cold, and too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peace, but pressure. JD sat on the hard bench. Hands still cuffed in front of him, his breathing shallow and uneven. The fluorescent lights above hummed a constant, sharp note that sliced through his concentration. Every time he blinked, he saw the blue arcs of the taser firing again in his mind. Like a flashbulb memory burned onto the back of his eyes. But the real noise wasn't in the room. It was in his head. And it never really stopped. 2 tours in, Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, over 100 missions. House to house, sweeps through villages where every window felt like the last one you'd ever see. Convoys through streets littered with the debris of someone else's yesterday. Explosions that didn't just take sound but warped time made. Seconds feel like hours and hours vanish in a blink. He came home with his hearing mostly intact, his body mostly functional, but his mind. That was another matter. He had a silver star. It was buried somewhere in the back of his closet inside a box he never opened. The metal itself had a faint scratch across the front from when it got knocked loose during a move. Not that it mattered. No one ever asked to see it. No one ever talked about what earned it least of all him. The report said he'd pulled 2 wounded men out of a flaming Humvee while under fire. That part was true. What it didn't say was that when he reached the 3rd soldier, the vehicle exploded, and the only thing left in his hands was the man's dog tag chain, still warm from the heat. JD didn't sleep for 3 days after that. He barely slept at all for the next 10 years, and when he did, the nightmares came. Not with monsters or ghosts, it's just simple things. The sound of boots on gravel, a door creaking open too slowly, the look in a kid's eyes when they got too close. To a truck that might have had wires trailing beneath it. There were nights when he woke up drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around him like restraints. Nights when he forgot where he was, who he was, what year it was. He'd learned to manage it the way most veterans did, with silence, routine, and space. Crowded rooms were bad. Sudden movements were worse, and authority figures barking commands from behind elevated desks. That was a perfect storm. So when he walked into the courtroom that day, wearing his best shirt, his best jeans, trying to look like something he didn't feel stable, controlled, harmless, he already knew it would be hard. He'd rehearsed it in his head the night before. Enter calmly. Answer questions clearly. Don't draw attention. Don't react. He didn't plan to stay seated when the judge entered. He just froze. The bailiff had yelled, "All rise," and his body had gone. Rigid, just like it used to when the radio crackled with intel on incoming fire. His muscles didn't respond. It's not because he wouldn't, but because he couldn't. And when the judge's tone turned cold, when the words disrespect and refusal were tossed around like accusations, something inside him recoiled. So violently he couldn't speak. All he could do was sit there, locked in place, waiting for the worst to come. And it had. The taser hit him harder than he expected, not just physically, but emotionally. Because it wasn't just the shock that hurt, it was the message it sent. Even now, after everything, after years of service and silence and survival, he could still be reduced to a threat with one misunderstood movement. He'd seen enemy fire. He'd felt the heat of war on his back. But nothing quite matched the humiliation of lying on the floor in handcuffs, while strangers judged his silence as defiance. For the rest of the country, a courtroom was a place of order and law. For J.D. Dalton, it was a minefield, and this time, he hadn't seen the explosion coming. The ride back to base was quiet, eyes fixed on the stretch of highway unfolding in front of them. The driver, a fellow Marine named Cruz, hadn't said much since they pulled out of Quantico. He didn't need to. They both felt it. That shift in the air, that pull in the gut that came before something big. Back at the barracks, the video still looped on every screen. No one cracked a joke to diffuse the tension. They all knew what it meant. It was one of theirs, a brother in arms. A name that had once passed through their unit's roster, now sprawled across a courtroom floor in front of people who couldn't begin to understand what it took for him to even show up. Emilio didn't wait to be asked. The moment they hit the base, he started making calls. Not through official channels. Those took too long. This needed to be fast, personal, precise. He dug through old contacts, some he hadn't spoken to since his third tour, some who owed him favors they hadn't expected to be called in on. By midnight, the plan was taking shape. 12 Marines. Not all active duty, but close enough. Every one of them had served with or alongside J.D. Dalton. Some owed him their lives. Others just remembered the way he carried the radio under fire, the way he refused to leave anyone behind. No one asked if this was against protocol. No one asked what the rules were. They asked one question only: where do we need to be? Meanwhile, Emilio sat alone in his room, the weight of what was coming pressing against his spine. He scrolled through old emails, looking for JD's last message. It had been short 2 years ago. Just a line, still standing. Some days, that's the win. Back then, Emilio had replied with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing more. He regretted that. Now, regretted how easy it was to let the war fade into quiet distance when the fighting stopped. Because for JD, it clearly never had. That night he didn't sleep. He didn't need to. His body was too wired, his heart too full. Not with rage, but with duty, the kind that never expired, the kind you didn't need a rank to follow. Across the country, whispers were growing louder. News outlets picked up the story. They replayed the video with slow-motion edits, expert commentary, statements from courthouse officials claiming protocol was followed. But the internet didn't buy it. The uniform JD once wore had its own voice now, million men and women who understood the way trauma follows you. How battles don't always end when the bullets stop. By morning, Emilio had locked in the date. The courthouse was 2 days away from JD's next hearing, an appearance to determine if charges of resisting arrest would be formally pressed. Emilio smiled without humor when he read that. Resisting arrest? For a man who sat still and said, "Please." He sent one final group message. "We show up together." Full dress blues. No words, just presence. One by one, the replies came in. Roger, I'll be there. Locked and loaded. And then the last one, from a Marine who hadn't spoken much since Fallujah. Time to remind them who we are. Emilio leaned back in his chair, exhaled slow, and finally let his eyes close, not to rest, not to forget, but to prepare. The ghosts of deployment were coming home, and they weren't walking in alone. The morning of, JD's hearing arrived with a sky the color of cold steel. Clouds hung low and thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had already formed, some holding signs, some holding coffee, others just holding space. Reporters hovered at the edges, cameras poised, waiting to catch a glimpse of whatever might unfold. They didn't know what they were waiting for exactly, but something was coming. They felt it in their bones. Inside the courtroom was quieter than usual. The bailiff kept glancing toward the door like he expected trouble but didn't know what kind. The judge, a man whose name no one remembered before last week, straightened the stack of papers on his desk with too much precision. His hand trembling slightly. JD had arrived in a transfer van, escorted by two deputies who kept their distance but not their judgment. He walked slower today, his body still aching from the voltage and the shame. He'd taken his belt, his watch, even the laces from his shoes. All he had now was the weight of 1,000 eyes watching and a silence that threatened to swallow him whole. He didn't look for the cameras, didn't meet the stares of the people who once looked right through him. He just walked to the defense table, sat down gently, and stared at his hands. They hadn't stopped shaking since that morning. Then it happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, purposeful. One by one, they stepped inside. 12 Marines, every one of them in full dress blues. The crowd didn't gasp, didn't cheer. They just stood slowly, like something sacred had entered the room. The Marines walked in formation, side by side, their boots clicking in perfect rhythm across the old tile floor. Not a single word was spoken, not a single smile cracked. Their uniforms were spotless metals gleaming, gloves crisp, faces unreadable. They made their way to the front rows of the gallery and sat. Row after row, filling up until every seat behind JD was occupied. For a moment, no one breathed. Even JD hadn't turned around yet. He didn't have to. He felt it. The shift. The weight behind him, like someone had finally put a hand on his shoulder just to say, "You're not alone anymore." The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Dalton," he began, voice struggling to sound. Composed, "We're here today to determine—" "I'd like to make a statement," came a voice from the gallery. It was Staff Sergeant Emilio Torres. He hadn't asked permission. He didn't need to. He rose slowly, every movement exact. The judge looked startled, but something in Torres's posture made him stop short of objection. "I'm not here to argue law," Torres said. "I'm here to remind this court of something we all seem to forget. That man," he pointed to JD, "carried brothers out of burning vehicles, stood between us and death more times than I can count. He didn't fail to rise out of disrespect. He froze, because some wounds don't bleed on the outside." Silence followed. The judge didn't respond. He couldn't. He just sat there, mouth slightly open, lost in the presence of something much older and deeper than courtroom authority. Torres sat. The Marines behind him didn't move. Outside, the story was already spreading. 12 Marines. No protests, no shouts. Just dignity and formation. Inside, JD finally turned his head. His eyes scanned the row behind him. Each face familiar, each expression calm. Just presence. It broke something open in him, not with tears, but with a breath. The first real one he'd taken in days. And in that moment, something shifted in the courtroom too. Not the verdict. Not the charges, something deeper, a reckoning. And it had just begun. The courtroom didn't move. It just held itself still in that moment, after Staff Sergeant Torres sat down, like even the walls were listening. The judge blinked, clearly unsettled, but unsure of what to say, what to do. Authority had a rhythm to it, gavel strikes raised. Voices, rules on paper. But this wasn't that. This was something different, something ancient. A quiet kind of power that didn't need to shout. JD sat straighter now. Not because the chains had disappeared, he was still cuffed, still labeled, but because the weight on his shoulders was finally shared. He looked at Torres, then to the Marine beside him, then to the end of the row. Some had taken leave without permission. One had flown, commercial in full dress uniform, just to make it on time. Not a single one of them came for applause. They came because they knew what silence costs. The prosecutor, a thin man with polished shoes and a briefcase heavier than his sense of shame, shuffled his papers nervously. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, we must proceed with the matter at hand. The defendant, the judge said suddenly, his voice catching slightly, served 3 combat tours, has no prior criminal record, and was visibly triggered during the events in question. He paused, looking out over the 12 Marines row after row of calm, blinking loyalty. The court recognizes that the presence of a service dog or emotional support measures may be necessary in future appearances, should there be any. There was a shift, a tiny one, but it carried weight. The judge looked at JD again, and for the first time there was no cold detachment in his eyes. There was something else. Not sympathy, not pity. Understanding. And in that thin sliver of humanity, something broke open wider than policy. Judge reached for his pen, made a few notes, and leaned back in his chair. He looked older now, smaller, like he'd realized how close he'd come to making a mistake that would follow him far beyond his. Courtroom walls, the gavel came down once. Lightly, case continued. Charges deferred pending review. Mr. Dalton is released on his own recognizance, effective immediately. A sound moved through the room, not a cheer, not applause. Just breath, relief, like someone had let the air back. In JD stood slowly, his legs still aching from the hit, but steady. Now one of the deputies stepped forward to uncuff him. For a brief second, the Marine flinched, but then he remembered where he was, who he was. The metal fell away. He turned to the row of Marines behind him. No words were needed, just nods. Small, firm, real. Torres rose last, stepped forward, clasped JD's shoulder. You're not broken, he said quietly. You were. Just fighting without backup? You got it now. And that was it. They walked out together, 12 Marines, in perfect step. One man in jeans and a worn shirt, all bound by something deeper than law. Cameras flashed outside, reporters shouted questions, but they didn't stop. They didn't need to explain. The world had seen what it needed to see. Honor doesn't always come with medals. Sometimes it comes dressed in quiet defiance. Boots polished to a mirror shine, and silence stronger than any argument. And as they moved toward the waiting cars, one by one, people in the crowd began to stand, not out of ceremony, but out of respect. For a man who didn't rise in court, and for the ones who did, the ride away from the courthouse wasn't marked by celebration. No music blaring, no fists raised, just the low hum of tires on asphalt. It's the kind of silence that only comes after holding your breath for too long. JD sat in the back of an SUV flanked by Torres and another Marine. Corporal Mason, a quiet man with eyes that didn't miss much. They didn't say anything at first. Didn't need to. The convoy of black vehicles moved slowly through the town of Latham Falls, past rows of spectators still gathered outside the courthouse. Some held flags. Some held signs that read, "We see you, JD." Others held nothing. But their gaze, watching in awe as the formation of Marines escorted a man who had, just days earlier, been treated like a criminal for a moment of pain. At a stoplight, JD looked out the window and saw a young boy standing on the sidewalk with his mother. The kid wore an oversized camouflage jacket and saluted with his entire arm. JD's breath caught. Not because of pride, because he remembered being that kid, looking up at uniforms and thinking they were untouchable. Now, here he was, bruised, exhausted, alive, and being saluted not for being perfect, but For surviving, they didn't go straight to the base. Instead, Torres had asked for a detour. Somewhere quiet, somewhere private. The vehicles pulled into the gravel lot of an old VFW hall on the edge of town. The paint was peeling. The flag out front was faded. But the inside was still sacred ground. They walked in together, boots echoing on the worn wooden floor. Air smelled faintly of coffee, sweat, and history. There were no speeches. No agenda. Just chairs in a loose circle, a coffee pot in the corner, and a few battered couches with throw pillows older than most of the men in the room. JD stood near the window for a long time before anyone said a word. "You don't have to talk," Torres finally offered. "But if you want to, it's the place." JD nodded, unsure. He wasn't good at talking anymore. War had a way of stealing your vocabulary and replacing it with silence. Still, something inside him shifted. He walked toward the center of the room, hesitated, then sat. At first all he said was, "I didn't mean to disrespect the court." No one answered. No one needed to. He continued, I heard the bailiff shout and the gavel hit, and then I wasn't in the room anymore. I was back in the convoy, the heat, the sound, the roadside dirt in my mouth." He paused. I swallowed. "I stood for something once. I still do. But my body, my brain, it doesn't always know the difference." Between now and then, one of the Marines leaned forward. A corporal who'd lost his leg in Kandahar. He didn't speak. He just held JD's eyes and nodded once, and that was enough. Over the next hour, more stories spilled out. Some quiet, some broken, some wrapped in dark humor only Marines could understand. They spoke about fire bases, about homecomings that felt like funerals, about trying to sleep with the lights off and failing every time. No one judged. No one interrupted. This wasn't therapy. This was truth. JD finally leaned back, shoulders slack for the first time in weeks. "I thought I was alone," he said softly. "You're not," Torres replied. "You never were. You just didn't know where we were standing. That night, they didn't fix anything. They didn't try to. But when JD stepped outside under the pale wash of moonlight, the air felt different. Lighter. The world had changed a little. Not because of a courtroom decision, but because 12 Marines had stood up when it mattered. And somewhere inside JD, something long frozen began to thaw. The following morning, JD woke before the sun. Not from nightmares this time, but from something quieter, something unfamiliar. Stillness. He sat at the edge of the borrowed bunk inside the old VFW hall. The creak of the springs beneath him, the only sound in the dim room. His boots were at his feet, neatly placed. His uniform folded across a nearby chair, hadn't been worn in years. But something told him he might need it again, not for battle, for something else. Something bigger than him. Downstairs, the hum of a percolator welcomed him like an old friend. Torres was already there, mug in hand, watching the lights spill through the dusty blinds. He didn't say good morning. He didn't need to. He just slid a fresh cup of coffee across the table and nodded toward the chair across from him. "You went viral," Torres said after a few moments. "Millions of views." JD stared into his coffee, forgetting tased. Torres gave a dry laugh. "Nah, for why you got tased." There was a pause between them, long and thoughtful. JD still wasn't sure how to carry what had happened. The humiliation, the anger, the weight of public sympathy when he'd spent years just trying to disappear. But he didn't feel the urge to run anymore. Not here. Not after yesterday, Torres continued. "We got a call from a major at Fort Talbot. They want to meet you." "Why?" JD asked. His voice was still gravel, still shaped by months of silence and shame. Torres leaned forward, serious now. "'Cause they think you might be the right voice for something. They've been building a peer-led program for PTSD support. Real faces, real stories. Ground-up healing, not top-down management. And they need someone who's already been through the fire." JD shook his head. "I'm no poster boy. No one's asking you to be," Torres said. "They just want you to show up, the same way you did for us." The air was heavy with possibility, terrifying, unwelcome, but also something close to hope. JD wasn't sure what to say. so he said nothing. He just took another sip and stared at the wall, where a faded American flag hung behind a case of old medals and grainy black and white photos, men who had fought wars long before his, some smiling, some haunted by noon. The Marines had returned to their bases, one by one peeling off with tight embraces, silent nods, and the unspoken promise. "We've got your six." Torres stayed behind, always had a way of hanging back, letting people choose the next step instead of pushing them toward it. Later that day, the first official statement came from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It didn't mention JD by name, not yet, but it acknowledged the incident. It's confirmed an internal review. It stated that recent events have highlighted a need for updated awareness and protocols regarding trauma response in public institutions. It was bureaucratic language, polished and safe. But between the lines, something else was beginning. A shift. People were watching, talking, asking questions. That night, JD stood outside the hall, phone in hand. Dozens of texts had come in. Reporters, friends he hadn't spoken to in years, even his old squad leader from his second tour. But one message stopped him cold. It was from Mia, the woman who had walked out of the courtroom the moment the taser had fired. They hadn't spoken in over 3 years. Her message was short. "I saw everything. I'm proud of you. If you want to talk, I'm here." He didn't reply. Not yet. But the phone stayed in his hand a little longer. Inside, Torres was making dinner, something simple, military style, rice, beans, and leftover roast. JD stepped in from the porch, the screen door creaking shut behind him. "I'll go," he said. Torres turned. "Go where?" "To Fort Talbot," JD replied. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do there, but I'll go." Torres smiled, a slow nod forming. "Good. You've already started." That night, JD sat at the long folding table, notebook open, pen in hand. He wrote the first sentence slowly, carefully. "My name is JD Dalton. I served 3 tours, and I'm still figuring out how to come home." It wasn't everything, but it was a start. The ride to Fort Talbot was quiet, long, and strangely calming. JD drove himself. Torres had offered to accompany him, but JD politely declined. There was something about crossing this particular threshold alone that felt important. It's like stepping into a storm, not to face it, but to stop pretending it wasn't there. The highway curved through open fields and forgotten towns, places that looked unchanged by time but felt ghosted by it. He passed a sign that read "Welcome Home Veterans" in faded blue paint. For the first time, he didn't scoff. By the time he reached the gates of Fort Talbot, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky with amber and slate. The guard at the checkpoint scanned his ID, hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Dalton." It had been a long time since anyone said that with sincerity. Inside the base, everything felt like muscle memory. The layout, cadence of footsteps, the distant sound of drills and boots slapping pavement. But JD wasn't here to fall in line again. It was here because something new was being built, and for the first time in years, he was being asked to be part of it. He was directed to a modest brick building near the northeast corner of the base. Building 219, labeled Veteran Integration and Recovery Initiative. The name sounded like something dreamed up in a DC conference room, but the building itself had soul. A few veterans stood outside smoking and talking quietly. No uniforms, just sweatshirts, caps, and tired eyes that lit up when they saw someone familiar. When JD stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was the bulletin board covered in handwritten notes. Job postings, photos of therapy dogs, and cards that read things like, "You're not alone, and we saved your seat." A woman in civilian clothes greeted him. Her name tag read CPT. Rachel Hernandez read. But there was nothing formal about her. She smiled like they were already old friends. "You're earlier than expected," she said, offering him a bottle of water. "That's a good sign." "I couldn't sit still," JD replied honestly. Rachel led him through a hallway filled with laughter, low voices, and the clinking of coffee mugs. There was no sterile coldness here, no polished metal and forced formality, just couches, dimmed lighting, and an unmistakable sense of permission Permission to not be okay? We don't expect speeches, Rachel said as they entered a side room with a circle of chairs. We don't expect you to fix anyone. We just want you to be real. If that means you don't say anything today, that's fine. JD took it in. The room. The silence. The slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The session started. With 5 others, all veterans from different wars, different lives, all tethered by the same invisible thread. An older Navy corpsman who wore grief like a second skin. A young National Guard medic who still twitched when someone slammed a door. A woman who hadn't removed her sunglasses indoors for 3 years. When it came to JD's turn, he hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because the weight of saying it still felt too close to the bone. I didn't come here to lead, he said slowly. I came because I got tased in a courtroom for not standing. Somehow, that made people pay attention. They listened. No one flinched. No one pitied. I didn't stand because I couldn't. Because that room felt like a place I'd been. Before, not a courtroom, but a convoy. A kill zone. I don't remember hearing the judge. I just remember noise. Heat. The kind that crawls under your skin and doesn't let go. A pause. Someone passed him a cup of water. He didn't drink. I'm not here because I've figured out how to be okay. I'm here because I'm tired of pretending I already am. Long silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of shared weight, of mutual unspoken truths. The older corpsman leaned forward, eyes glinting. Welcome. Home, brother. It was the simplest phrase in the world. JD felt it land in a place no metal ever touched. After the session, Rachel walked with him to the parking lot. The wind had picked up, brushing against them like memory. Think you'll come back? She sked. You looked at the building. Then at his hands, and then at the horizon. I think I never left, he said. She smiled. That's how you know it's working. As he pulled away that evening, he didn't feel like a man driving away from a base. Felt like someone finally driving toward something. Toward purpose, toward peace. Maybe not today, maybe not all at once, but toward. The next morning, JD found himself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not out of vanity, out of uncertainty. His reflection didn't look different, but something inside him had shifted. He didn't flinch at his own eyes anymore. There was still weight in them, yes, but there was also something steadier. A foundation had begun to rebuild itself, brick by honest brick. He wasn't sure what exactly had changed. Maybe it was the moment someone said, "Welcome home, brother." Or maybe it was hearing other people speak their pain without apology. Either way, he felt less like a ghost and more like someone real. Not healed, not whole, but real. That afternoon, JD returned to Fort Talbot for a second session, not as a guest, but as a peer facilitator. Rachel greeted him at the door with a quiet smile, handed him a clipboard, not with checkboxes or protocols, but a list of first names and one simple note at the bottom. Just hold space. The group was slightly larger this time. Word had spread about the Marine from the video. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet desperation. JD could sense it, the ones who hovered near the edge of the room, unsure whether to sit or bolt. He recognized that feeling too well. Before the session started, he walked over to a young man with a crew cut and jittery hands. The kid wore a hoodie and jeans, but beneath that was the unmistakable posture of someone trained to scan exits. JD didn't ask his name. He didn't ask what branch. He just offered a seat next to him and said, "You don't have to talk. You just have to stay." The kid nodded once and sat. During the session, voices cracked open again, one by one. A woman talked about not recognizing her own daughter after deployment, about how loud the silence became when her little girl learned not to wake her up suddenly. Reservist admitted that he hadn't left his apartment in 2 weeks. Not because he was afraid of the world, because he was afraid of being seen by it. When it was JD's turn, he didn't plan anything. He never did. I used to think strength meant keeping it all in, he said, voice low but steady. Out. Turns out it just made everything louder in my head. A few heads nodded. A few tears slipped without shame. There's no magic to this. No fix. Some days I still wake up thinking I'm back over there, but I come here now. I sit with people who understand what I can't explain. That helps. There was no applause, no dramatic music. Just quiet, understanding silence, the kind that spoke louder than any words. Afterward, Rachel approached him with a look that was half gratitude, half concern. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, then paused. "No, but better. Not that." Night, he stayed behind to help clean up, folding chairs, wiping down tables, restocking the coffee supplies. It reminded him of simpler times, of fire watches and mess duties and the comfort of repetition. It wasn't about the task. It was about being useful. Before he left, Rachel handed him a thick envelope. "Someone dropped this off for you." He opened it in the parking lot beneath the fading twilight. Inside was a handwritten letter. At first, he didn't recognize the handwriting. But halfway through the first line, his breath hitched. "JD, I don't know if you remember me. We served together, Bravo Company, Sangin District. 2011, you pulled me out of that wreck when the ambush hit. I've been trying to track you down." For years, attached was a photo, grainy, dust-filled, a young version of JD. It's barely 26, hauling a wounded Marine across the dirt. Both faces were covered in soot. But the eyes were the same. I saw the video. I just wanted. "You two know, ... You've saved me twice." That day, and again last week, Mendes J.D. leaned back against the car and stared at the letter until the light was too low to read it anymore. He folded it slowly, carefully, and placed it inside his wallet, behind his old military ID. He didn't cry, didn't break, but he stood there for a long time, letting the wind touch his face, and whispered quietly to no one and everyone, "Maybe I was meant to stay." The courtroom was different now, not in its furniture or its formality, but in the way the air moved, thicker somehow, like it remembered. Word had gotten around about the video, about the fallout, about the Marines. So when J.D. Dalton walked through those double doors for his arraignment hearing, the gallery wasn't half empty like last time. It was standing room only. Veterans in ball caps, Gold Star families, active duty soldiers in pressed uniforms, badges and bars glinting under the overhead lights. Even a few civilians, teachers, nurses, strangers, people who had nothing to gain from being there except the knowledge that they should be. JD didn't look left or right as he entered. He didn't need to. He could feel the presence of every person behind him, like a tide, steady, rising, unflinching. The judge took her seat, her face unreadable, her robe crisp. Case 61,843, the bailiff called out. People versus John David Dalton. JD stepped forward. His hands were no longer in cuffs, but they trembled slightly all the same. His attorney, a young woman named Erica Monroe, had volunteered to represent him after seeing the video. "Your Honor," she began, voice calm and direct, "we're filing a motion to dismiss all charges. What occurred in this courtroom last week was not defiance. It was a medical crisis tied to Mr. Dalton's combat-related PTSD, later confirmed by multiple military doctors. The prosecutor, a man with too much gel in his hair and not enough empathy in his eyes, rose with a sigh. With respect, Your Honor, courtroom decorum exists for a reason. If we excuse disrespect under the guise of trauma, where does it end?" Someone in the gallery stirred, a uniform shifted, then another, and another, like a ripple. The judge didn't look at them. She looked at JD. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her tone measured but not unkind. "Is this true? Are you unable to stand due to a medical condition?" JD didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But it's more than that." A pause stretched. His lawyer gently touched his sleeve, a silent, "You don't have to." But JD needed to. He stepped slightly forward. The judge allowed it. "I was in a courtroom once before," he said. "Not here. It's not in this country. It was a dirt floor, collapsed walls. We were securing a site in Helmand Province. Taliban had been holding civilians hostage inside what used to be a school. When we entered, the first thing I saw was a man standing, arms raised. and I didn't know if he had a bomb strapped to his chest or a child in his arms. The room was silent. Even the prosecutor's face began to pale. I see that man's face every time I'm in a room like this. It doesn't matter that it's safe. My brain doesn't know the difference. That day in this courtroom, when the bailiff shouted when the room rose, it hit me like a memory I never asked to keep. He looked down, then back up again. I didn't stand. Your Honor, not because I wanted to disrespect the court, but because in that moment I wasn't in a court. I was back there. I couldn't move. The judge blinked slowly. Then something shifted in her posture. She turned to the prosecutor. Do you wish to continue with charges, counsel? The man looked at the room, at the uniforms lining every pew, the quiet certainty on JD's face, and finally at the judge. No, Your Honor, he said. Then charges are dismissed, she said. You are free to go, Sergeant Dalton. Beat passed. Then the smallest sound, a hand slapping against a thigh in a slow, respectful clap. 1, then 2. Then the room rose, not in outrage this time, but in honor. 12 Marines in dress blues stood together, forming a line down. The center aisle, Torres among them, silent, proud, and for the first time. JD stood with them, on his own terms. As he exited the courtroom, reporters surged, cameras clicked, questions flew. What? But he didn't stop. He didn't explain, just walked into the sunlight. Where Torres waited beside an idling military vehicle, you handled that like a damn officer, Torres said. I'm not, JD replied. Exactly. Torres smiled. And yet they stood for you anyway. That night, back at Fort Talbot, JD added a new entry to the whiteboard Rachel had put up weeks ago. Question no one had written yet. What does healing look like? And beneath it, in his own crooked handwriting, he wrote the answer. When you no longer flinch at your own name. Rain tapped steadily against the roof of the truck as JD sat parked outside the Fort Talbot Wellness Center. Hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long gone cold. He hadn't meant to arrive early. In fact, he'd spent most of the morning trying to talk himself out of coming at all. But something, maybe the silence, maybe the memory of 12 Marines rising to their feet had driven him here. Inside, the center was already awake. Not loud, not busy, but alive in that quiet way trauma spaces often were. Soft voices, slow movements, a careful balance between privacy and presence. Rachel greeted him with a nod, no fanfare. Just the kind of steady acknowledgement that doesn't demand conversation but leaves room for it if needed. We've got someone new today, she said, walking beside him down the hall. Just got in from the base hospital. She hasn't said much. Refuses to sit in a group. Said she'd only stay if she didn't have to explain. JD raised an eyebrow. Sounds familiar? Rachel smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked if we had any other broken people who don't want to be fixed. Thought you might be the right one to talk to her. JD nodded. Adjusting the strap of his jacket, room, east wing, the one with the window. He knocked softly before entering. The room was empty, except for a woman sitting in the far corner, hood up, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Single. Cat, a folded duffel bag at her feet. A dog tag looped around her wrist instead of her neck. She didn't look up. Name's JD, he said, staying near the door. No rank, no clipboard, no pitch. Still no response. He tried again. He said you didn't want to talk, so I figured maybe you'd be okay just listening. Die. Woman exhaled through her nose, short, irritated. I know what silence sounds like when it's working, he said. But I also know what it sounds like when it's screaming. That got her. Yell. She turned just enough to glance sideways, and for a moment he saw her eyes. Alert, wary, exhausted. A minefield behind them. He stayed where he was. Sat on the floor. Leaned against the wall. I got tased in a courtroom a few weeks ago, he said, casually. Whole damn thing went viral. Not because of what I did, but because a bunch of Marines walked in afterward like it was a damn war movie. That made her blink just once. He pressed on. After that, I kept getting these messages. From people I haven't seen since deployment. From people I never even met. They all said the same thing. Not we're sorry or that was wrong. No. What they said was, "I've been there too." He watched her hand twitch, the one resting near the dog tag. "I don't know what happened to you," he said, "and I won't ask. But I can tell you one thing. You're not the only one who brought something home you didn't pack." Her jaw clenched, then relaxed. The hood slid back a little as she shifted. "My name's Olivia," she said finally, voice barely audible. "Army. 68W. I didn't sign up to carry coffins." He nodded slowly. "I didn't sign up to come back to a country that calls me a hero, but treats me like a problem." For the first time, she looked directly at him. Really looked. "Do they all sit on the floor in here?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. He grinned. "The ones who know standing doesn't make you taller." They sat there in silence for a while after that, the kind that didn't ache or shout. Just space, shared stillness. Two strangers alike, in the way only those shaped by war could be. Later that afternoon, JD found Rachel by the coffee machine. She said she'd stay the week, he told her. Rachel handed him a fresh cup. "She asked for a dog," she said. "We've got a therapy shepherd coming from Atlanta tomorrow." JD nodded. "Good." As he stepped outside, the rain had let up. The clouds parted just enough to let a narrow beam of sunlight fall across the parking lot. He took a deep breath. There was no parade, no applause, no great epiphany. Just one quiet truth. Healing doesn't always start with answers. Sometimes it begins with a floor, a stranger, and a story you're finally ready to tell. The smell of charcoal and coffee drifted lazily through the air as twilight settled over Fort Talbot. It was Friday, which meant fire pit night, a ritual that had taken root over the past few weeks. No formal invitations, no speeches, no schedule. Just a slow gathering of people who understood each other without having to try. JD stood near the edge of the circle, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee, watching as a young corporal helped set kindling beneath the logs. Rachel sat nearby, her eyes scanning the crowd like she always did, not out of worry, but attentiveness, as if counting the ones who made it through another week. Across the flame, Olivia had returned. Hood down this time, dog tag still looped. Around her wrist, next to her, curled at her feet, was the therapy shepherd that had arrived earlier that week. The dog's name was Boone. Quiet, steady, golden-furred and calm in a way most of them weren't used to feeling. Someone tossed another log into the fire. Sparks rose like fireflies, lifting into the dusk. Conversations drifted between pockets of silence. Some talked openly, others didn't say a word. Few laughed in short bursts, quick, cautious, like muscles relearning how to move. Vietnam. Vet told a story about trying to fix his grandkid's toy helicopter and somehow ending up gluing his fingers together. Laughter rolled around the fire like wind through dry leaves. JD shifted his weight, eyes moving from face to face. Every person there carried something invisible, wounds, not stitched by medics, but by time, distance, and quiet understanding. They'd stopped trying to explain their scars to the world. Here they didn't have to. Then Rachel stepped in too, the glow of the firelight holding a small cardboard box. She cleared her throat gently, and the group instinctively quieted. "We found this in one of the storage closets," she said, tapping the box with her fingers. Letters. Dozens of them, from former soldiers, Marines, spouses, some even from kids. Most were written and never sent.
Oh.
Some weren't even finished. She opened the box, pulled one out, and unfolded it carefully. "This one," she said, glancing at the paper, "is from a guy named Travis. He wrote it the night before his third deployment, but never mailed it to his sister." She paused, then read aloud. "Hey, Jamie, I'm sorry I haven't called. I know you're mad, but I'm scared, and I don't know how to say that without sounding weak. I know Dad always said we don't talk about that stuff, but I'm tired of pretending I'm a wall. I miss your dumb jokes. I miss Mom's meatloaf. I miss being a person. Anyway, if I don't come back, tell her I tried. Not for the war. For the guys next to me. Always for them." When she finished, the fire popped gently,
Us.
as if marking the end of the letter with punctuation no one asked for. No one clapped. No one spoke. But everyone felt ITJD stared into the flames. That letter could have been his, or Torres, Olivia's, or any of the ghosts that still hovered around their edges. Rachel folded the letter and put it back. "We'll read one each week," she said. "No pressure, no obligation. Just a way to remember the pieces of us we almost forgot." From the shadows, Torres stepped forward. Still in uniform from base duties, sleeves rolled, boots dusty. "I brought something too," he said, lifting a small canvas satchel. "Unit coins. From brothers and sisters who didn't make it.
Ow.
I thought it was time they came somewhere quieter." He knelt by the fire and placed them, one by one, in a circle just outside the flames. Each coin gleamed faintly in the flickering light, a ring of remembrance. JD watched as Olivia reached out slowly, adding a dog tag to the line of coins. Boone didn't stir, just pressed gently against her leg. No one spoke of patriotism. No one invoked politics. This wasn't about country or conflict. It was about presence. Pain shared and dignity returned that night. As the fire burned low and the stars began to take their places overhead, JD took out the old notebook he'd once carried behind a courtroom wall. He turned to a fresh page and wrote down 3 words that felt heavier than most. "We are here." Because sometimes survival wasn't the loud act of coming home. It was the quiet choice to stay. The next morning came with the kind of pale, overcast light that made everything feel suspended, like the world was waiting for something to happen but didn't know what. The halls of the Fort Talbot Wellness Center were still quiet, the hum of ceiling vents and distant murmurs from the kitchen the only signs of life. JD arrived early, as he had for the last few days, but this time his steps carried an extra weight. Something had shifted overnight. It wasn't just the fire pit or the letters or even the dog lying across Olivia's feet. It was something else, something unspoken but undeniable. Like the center was starting to breathe on its own, he found Rachel in the office, sorting through a stack of mail with her usual calm. She looked up, her expression already telling him she knew what he was going to say. "They're coming," JD said quietly. Rachel didn't flinch. She just nodded and set the envelopes aside. "How many? 12? Maybe more?" He ran, a hand over his face. "Stuff SCT. Torres confirmed it this morning. They've coordinated with a few others from different bases. Not just Marines either. Army, Navy, even a Coast Guard guy who said he just didn't want to be the only branch left out." Rachel managed a small smile, but her eyes stayed sharp. "They're coming here?" He shook his head. "There." Going back to the courtroom, silence stretched between them for a moment. Not to protest, he clarified. To speak. To testify. To stand next to the man they watched get dropped by a taser because he wouldn't stand for a judge he didn't even see. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "It's going to make waves. Already is." Pulled out his phone and set it on the table. A video was paused mid-frame. Olivia, sitting beside Boone, her face calm but unmistakably determined. "She gave a short interview last night," he said. One of the local vets who freelances for the news asked if she'd be willing to speak. She said she wasn't ready to tell her story, but she was ready to back someone else's. He hit play. "This isn't about disrespect," Olivia said, her voice quiet but unshaking. "It's about what people carry. I sat through too many ceremonies where everyone stood, but no one saw me. JD didn't stand up, but he showed up. That's more than I can say for a lot of us." Rachel watched without blinking when the video ended. JD looked down. "It's happening again. Not a storm this time. A reckoning, but softer. Smarter, stronger." Rachel didn't speak right. Away. Then, finally, she said, "Do you know what they'll say when they take that stand?" "No," JD replied, "but I know why they'll say it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. The top corner was stamped with a courthouse seal. "Summons came in this morning," he said. "They're retrying the case. Same judge, different spotlight." Rachel took the envelope from him, her hand steady, even as the tension in the air rose. "We've seen this before," she said. "Institution, trying to reassert itself. It's trying to tell a story it no longer owns. This timed. We write it ourselves." That afternoon, Torres arrived with a clipboard and a guest log. One by one, the names were added. 12 veterans, all scheduled to testify. All volunteers. By sunset, the center was buzzing in its own quiet way. Olivia helped rearrange chairs in the main room. Rachel sat with a young airman still fresh from deployment, walking him through what the courtroom would look like, and J.D. He stood near the entrance, watching each new arrival step through the door, with the kind of quiet resolve that didn't need to be explained. None of them wore suits. None rehearsed speeches. They carried themselves like they'd carried each. Other and worse places, when the last name hit the list, Rachel walked over to where J.D. was standing. "You nervous?" He shrugged. "Yeah, but it's not the kind that keeps you up. It's the kind that gets you there." Outside, the sky was shifting against storm clouds in the distance. Yes, but not the kind that brought chaos. The kind that made people watch. The horizon, knowing something was about to change, and for the first time since that brutal morning in court, J.D. didn't feel small. Didn't feel like a broken man in a broken system. He felt seen, and this time, he wouldn't be standing alone. The courthouse looked different this time. Same steps. Same worn seal above the entrance. Same polished marble floors that seemed to reflect everything except the truth. But the air was heavier, thicker. As if the building itself sensed what was coming and braced for it. J.D. arrived early. But he wasn't the first. Olivia was already seated on the bench outside the courtroom. Boone at her feet, her hands clasped tightly around a coffee cup she hadn't sipped from. She didn't look up when he approached, just shifted slightly to make room beside her. He sat without a word. One by one they came. Not in formation, not in uniform, but in unity. 12 men and women, each shaped by different branches, different wars, different scars. Some wore dress blues, crisp and formal. Others came in jeans and button-downs, clean but not rehearsed. They didn't walk like protesters. They walked like people who had nothing left to prove and lead something left to protect. Inside the courtroom, the same judge sat high above the room, robes uncreased, gavel ready. But this time, the gallery wasn't filled with curious onlookers or bored reporters. It was filled with presence. With weight, phones were turned off. Not because anyone asked, but because they knew what was about to happen mattered more than signal. J.D.'s name was called first. He rose slowly. Spine stiffened. By both nerves and defiance, as he walked past the rows of veterans seated behind him, he caught glimpses Torres' nod, Olivia's steady gaze. The quiet encouragement of a dozen people who'd been through fire and still showed up. He took the stand. "What happened on the morning of the incident?" the defense asked. J.D.S. Jaw tensed. His voice was level, but low. "I was present for sentencing on a charge I don't deny. I entered the courtroom and remained seated. Why didn't you stand?" He didn't flinch, because I couldn't. A murmur ran through the gallery, not of surprise, but of recognition. The judge leaned forward. "You're saying you were physically incapable?" "I'm saying I was emotionally deployed," J.D. said. "That courtroom looked too much like a tribunal I sat in during my 3rd deployment. Same wood, same spacing, same authority. My heart rate spiked. My hands shook. My vision narrowed. I wasn't disrespecting the court. I was reliving something I never asked to bring home." Silence. Then the prosecutor stood, young, polished, trying hard to remain unimpressed. You expect the court to believe that a Marine decorated with a silver star was too anxious to stand. From the back, Torres coughed once, loud enough to be heard. Sharp enough to sting. J.D. looked up. "The silver star's in a drawer, next to the night terrors. Doesn't shield me from flashbacks." The prosecutor faltered. For a moment, the entire courtroom sat still, breathing the truth of it. Then came the rest. She opened the box, pulled one out, and unfolded it carefully. "This one," she said, glancing at the paper, "is from a guy named Travis. He wrote it the night before his 3rd deployment, but never mailed it to his sister." She paused, then read aloud. "Hey, Jamie, I'm sorry I haven't called. I know you're mad, but I'm scared, and I don't know how to say that without sounding weak. I know Dad always said we don't talk about that stuff, but I'm tired of pretending I'm a wall. I miss your dumb jokes. I miss Mom's meatloaf. I miss being a person. Anyway, if I don't come back, tell her I tried. Not for the war. For the guys next to me. Always for them." When she finished, the fire popped gently,
Us.
as if marking the end of the letter with punctuation no one asked for. No one clapped. No one spoke. But everyone felt ITJD stared into the flames. That letter could have been his, or Torres, Olivia's, or any of the ghosts that still hovered around their edges. Rachel folded the letter and put it back. "We'll read one each week," she said. "No pressure, no obligation. Just a way to remember the pieces of us we almost forgot." From the shadows, Torres stepped forward. Still in uniform from base duties, sleeves rolled, boots dusty. "I brought something too," he said, lifting a small canvas satchel. "Unit coins. From brothers and sisters who didn't make it.
Ow.
I thought it was time they came somewhere quieter." He knelt by the fire and placed them, one by one, in a circle just outside the flames. Each coin gleamed faintly in the flickering light, a ring of remembrance. JD watched as Olivia reached out slowly, adding a dog tag to the line of coins. Boone didn't stir, just pressed gently against her leg. No one spoke of patriotism. No one invoked politics. This wasn't about country or conflict. It was about presence. Pain shared and dignity returned that night. As the fire burned low and the stars began to take their places overhead, JD took out the old notebook he'd once carried behind a courtroom wall. He turned to a fresh page and wrote down 3 words that felt heavier than most. "We are here." Because sometimes survival wasn't the loud act of coming home. It was the quiet choice to stay. The next morning came with the kind of pale, overcast light that made everything feel suspended, like the world was waiting for something to happen but didn't know what. The halls of the Fort Talbot Wellness Center were still quiet, the hum of ceiling vents and distant murmurs from the kitchen the only signs of life. JD arrived early, as he had for the last few days, but this time his steps carried an extra weight. Something had shifted overnight. It wasn't just the fire pit or the letters or even the dog lying across Olivia's feet. It was something else, something unspoken but undeniable. Like the center was starting to breathe on its own, he found Rachel in the office, sorting through a stack of mail with her usual calm. She looked up, her expression already telling him she knew what he was going to say. "They're coming," JD said quietly. Rachel didn't flinch. She just nodded and set the envelopes aside. "How many? 12? Maybe more?" He ran, a hand over his face. "Stuff SCT. Torres confirmed it this morning. They've coordinated with a few others from different bases. Not just Marines either. Army, Navy, even a Coast Guard guy who said he just didn't want to be the only branch left out." Rachel managed a small smile, but her eyes stayed sharp. "They're coming here?" He shook his head. "There." Going back to the courtroom, silence stretched between them for a moment. Not to protest, he clarified. To speak. To testify. To stand next to the man they watched get dropped by a taser because he wouldn't stand for a judge he didn't even see. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "It's going to make waves. Already is." Pulled out his phone and set it on the table. A video was paused mid-frame. Olivia, sitting beside Boone, her face calm but unmistakably determined. "She gave a short interview last night," he said. One of the local vets who freelances for the news asked if she'd be willing to speak. She said she wasn't ready to tell her story, but she was ready to back someone else's. He hit play. "This isn't about disrespect," Olivia said, her voice quiet but unshaking. "It's about what people carry. I sat through too many ceremonies where everyone stood, but no one saw me. JD didn't stand up, but he showed up. That's more than I can say for a lot of us." Rachel watched without blinking when the video ended. JD looked down. It's happening again. Not a storm this time. A reckoning, but softer. Smarter. Stronger. Rachel didn't speak right. Away. Then, finally, she said, "Do you know what they'll say when they take that stand?" "No," JD replied. "But I know why they'll say it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. The top corner was stamped with a courthouse seal. Summons came in this morning, he said. They're retrying the case. Same judge, different spotlight. Rachel took the envelope from him, her hands steady, even as the tension in the air rose. We've seen this before, she said. Institution, trying to reassert itself. It's trying to tell a story it no longer owns. This timed. We write it ourselves. That afternoon, Torres arrived with a clipboard and a guest log. One by one, the names were added. 12 veterans, all scheduled to testify. All volunteers. By sunset, the center was buzzing in its own quiet way. Olivia helped rearrange chairs in the main room. Rachel sat with a young airman still fresh from deployment, walking him through what the courtroom would look like, and J.D. He stood near the entrance, watching each new arrival step through the door, with the kind of quiet resolve that didn't need to be explained. None of them wore suits. None rehearsed speeches. They carried themselves like they'd carried each. Other and worse places, when the last name hit the list, Rachel walked over to where J.D. was standing. You nervous? He shrugged. Yeah, but it's not the kind that keeps you up. It's the kind that gets you there. Outside, the sky was shifting against storm clouds in the distance. Yes, but not the kind that brought chaos. The kind that made people watch. The horizon, knowing something was about to change, and for the first time since that brutal morning in court, J.D. didn't feel small. Didn't feel like a broken man in a broken system. He felt seen, and this time, he wouldn't be standing. Alone, the courthouse looked different this time. Same steps. Same worn seal above the entrance. Same polished marble floors that seemed to reflect everything except the truth. But the air was heavier, thicker. As if the building itself sensed what was coming, and braced for it. J.D. arrived early. But he wasn't the first. Olivia was already seated on the bench outside the courtroom. Boone at her feet, her hands clasped tightly around a coffee cup she hadn't sipped from. She didn't look up when he approached, just shifted slightly to make room beside her. He sat without a word. One by one they came. Not in formation, not in uniform, but in unity. 12 men and women, each shaped by different branches, different wars, different scars. Some wore dress blues, crisp and formal. Others came in jeans and button-downs, clean but not rehearsed. They didn't walk like protesters. They walked like people who had nothing left to prove and lead something left to protect. Inside the courtroom, the same judge sat high above the room, robes uncreased, gavel ready. But this time, the gallery wasn't filled with curious onlookers or bored reporters. It was filled with presence. With weight, phones were turned off. Not because anyone asked, but because they knew what was about to happen mattered more than signal. J.D.'s name was called first. He rose slowly. Spine stiffened. By both nerves and defiance, as he walked past the rows of veterans seated behind him, he caught glimpses Torres' nod, Olivia's steady gaze. The quiet encouragement of a dozen people who'd been through fire and still showed up. He took the stand. What happened on the morning of the incident? The defense asked. J.D.S. Jaw tensed. His voice was level, but low. I was present for sentencing on a charge I don't deny. I entered the courtroom and remained seated. Why didn't you stand? He didn't flinch, because I couldn't. A murmur ran through the gallery, not of surprise, but of recognition. The judge leaned forward. You're saying you were physically incapable? I'm saying I was emotionally deployed, J.D. said. That courtroom looked too much like a tribunal I sat in during my 3rd deployment. Same wood, same spacing, same authority. My heart rate spiked. My hands shook. My vision narrowed. I wasn't disrespecting the court. I was reliving something I never asked to bring home. Silence. Then the prosecutor stood, young, polished, trying hard to remain unimpressed. You expect the court to believe that a Marine decorated with a silver star was too anxious to stand. From the back, Torres coughed once, loud enough to be heard. Sharp enough to sting. J.D. looked up. The silver star's in a drawer, next to the night terrors. Doesn't shield me from flashbacks. The prosecutor faltered. For a moment, the entire courtroom sat still, breathing the truth of it. Then came the rest. One by one, they were called, each veteran stepping forward, not to defend JD as a man, but to contextualize him as a soldier. Livia spoke of nights under beds, of lighting that triggered memories instead of peace. A Navy corpsman described the phantom smells that brought him to his knees in parking lots. An Army lieutenant shared how his daughter once screamed when he startled at a microwave beep. None of them cried. None of them dramatized. They simply offered what they'd once been told to hide, the cost, by the end of the testimonies. The room wasn't quiet from order, it was quiet from understanding, the kind that goes deeper than verdicts. The judge cleared his throat. This court does not condone disobedience, but it also cannot ignore the humanity behind it. Paused. This case is dismissed. The record will reflect that the actions taken against Mr. Dalton were based on a misunderstanding of psychological injury. It's misunderstanding that this court now seeks to rectify. Gavel done, but no one moved. Not yet. Then Torres stood. It's not to speak, not to perform. It's just to walk forward and offer JD something no sentence could give. His coin, unit coin, wired through Fallujah. Wait, history, he pressed it into JD's hand and said only 2 words, "You're home." And that's when JD felt it, not victory, not relief, just release. He wasn't just forgiven, he was understood. The sun outside the courthouse hit, differently brighter somehow. Though the clouds hadn't moved, the 12 veterans lingered on the courthouse steps, not with celebratory shouts or waving signs, but with a kind of quiet gravity. JD stood at the center of them, his hands loose at his sides, the weight of the unit coin still heavy in his palm. Reporters began to gather, creeping in like fog. One asked for a quote, another asked about the verdict, but no one answered at first. Not out of defiance, out of reverence. It was Olivia who broke the silence. "He wasn't on trial," she said calmly. "Trauma was." Then she turned, walked down the steps, and didn't look back. The group followed, scattering in small waves, some to their cars, others down the sidewalk toward nowhere in particular. But JD didn't leave. Not yet. He stood alone on the courthouse steps, his eyes tracing the courthouse seal etched into the stone above the doors. This building had taken something from him. Today, it had given something back, not justice. Exactly, but a beginning. Across the street, Rachel waited in her car. When he finally walked over, she rolled down the window without saying a word, just watching him. "You want a ride?" she asked. He hesitated. "No, I think I want to walk." Rachel smiled softly, understanding more than she let on. "Ow. See you at the center?" He nodded and turned away, his boots tapping softly on the sidewalk, like punctuation marks on a story still being written. Word traveled fast. By evening, the internet had exploded with clips from the courtroom. The image of 12 veterans standing in solidarity with JD went viral within hours. Headlines varied. Some called it redemption, others called it revolution. But none of them truly captured what had happened. It wasn't a protest, wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a correction. At the Fort Talbot Wellness Center, Olivia pinned a printed photo to the bulletin board in the main room. It showed the group on the courthouse steps, their faces solemn, proud. Underneath it, she scribbled a quote in black marker. "We stood because he couldn't. Not for the judge, for each other." That night, the center filled with more visitors than usual, veterans from nearby towns. Civilians who had watched the video and just wanted to say thank you. Even a local pastor who offered to volunteer on weekends. The building buzzed with something more than activity, pulsed with PURPOSEJD returned late. No fanfare, no applause. Just the sound of the front door quietly clicking shut behind him. Walked down the hall past the photos, the letters, the laughter still echoing faintly from the main room. And when he reached the far wall, he stopped. There was a new photo there. Him on the witness stand. His shoulders square, his hands still. A moment of vulnerability caught in still life. Beneath it, someone had written, "Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands still." He touched the edge of the frame, then turned and walked toward the back past the kitchen, past the fire pit, all the way to the quiet corner where the dogs usually curled up beside their humans. Boone lay there now, head lifted, tail thumping. Once an RECOGNITIONJD sat beside him and exhaled slowly, like something inside him had finally finished falling. From the front of the building, someone began playing guitar. Soft chords. Something. Old. Familiar. A song JD had heard once under desert stars. He didn't cry, but his chest felt loose in a way that had nothing to do with breath. Out in the parking lot, a father sat in his car with his teenage son, debating whether to come. The boy had just aged out of counseling services at the VA. He hadn't spoken much since his brother died overseas. "They're not therapists," the father said, unsure. The boy looked through the windshield, toward the warm yellow lights spilling. "From the windows? No," he said. "But they look like they get it." Inside, the circle was forming again. JD didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was already heard. The next morning broke quietly over Fort Talbot. The sky painted in soft streaks of blue and rust, as if even the sun was taking its time to rise. Inside the wellness center, the coffee brewed early. Olivia arrived before anyone else, as she always did, unlocking the door with a sigh she didn't know she'd been holding. She straightened the chairs, wiped down the table near the back window, and placed fresh dog treats in the ceramic bowl near the entrance. It was routine, but today it felt sacred. JD came in just after 8. No ceremony, no nod to the night before. He just walked through the door like a man who finally had permission to enter his own life again. Olivia looked up, offered him a quiet morning, and he returned it just as gently. No one brought up the courtroom. No one had to, as the hours passed. More veterans filtered in, not with appointments or therapy, slips, just instinct. Like they felt something had shifted and didn't want to miss whatever came next. Boone lay curled by the fireplace, head on his paws, tail twitching. Now and then, as new faces arrived. At one point, a young man barely out of uniform walked in, holding Alicia's hand, trembling slightly. The leash led to a dog with wide eyes and a nervous gait, its vest barely buckled. "First time?" JD asked from across the room. The young man nodded. For both of us, JD didn't move. Just raised his coffee cup in quiet welcome. That was enough. By noon, the place was full. It wasn't loud. It never was. It's just the low hum of people who understood one another without needing to explain. A group gathered on the back patio around the fire pit. Someone tossed a tennis ball for Boone. Laughter cracked once, and for a moment, the heaviness that usually clung to spaces like this lifted. Olivia stood near the window, watching it all. She didn't say much, just observed as she always had. And then her phone buzzed. A message. Unmarked number. Turn on the news. She stepped into the office, clicked the small TV mounted above the filing cabinet, and tuned in. The screen blinked into a midday news segment already in progress. A commentator, wide-eyed, sat across from a government official, jacket tight. Tie looser than protocol, probably liked. And so, in light of the public response to the Tasing incident involving decorated Marine Jonathan Dalton, the Department of Veterans Affairs has announced a formal review of courtroom protocols involving PTSD and service dogs. The screen flashed to video. JD in the courtroom, frozen in that moment on the stand, his voice steady as he said, "I wasn't disrespecting the court. I was reliving something I never asked to bring home." Then the headline, VA launches National Initiative following Fort Talbot case, the Dalton Standard in discussion. Olivia blinked. Dalton Standard. The words hit like a breath held too long. She stepped back out into the hallway and saw JD sitting near the bookshelf, reading a note left behind by a fellow vet. She didn't say anything at first, just watched. Him, this man who once walked in broken, now unknowingly shaping policy for others like him. "Hey," she called gently. He looked up. "You're on TV." JD frowned. "Is it a good photo?" Olivia grinned. "You're lucky it's in profile." They both laughed, quick, honest, and brief. Then the room fell back into that warm quiet. JD stood and walked outside where others had gathered. He didn't announce anything, didn't bring up the news. But the atmosphere shifted slightly like a ripple through still water. Word spread within minutes. Some cheered. Others fell silent, processing what it meant. One man stared at the grass for a long time before whispering, "Maybe they'll finally start listening." JD just listened, didn't want the credit, but he'd accept the purpose. Later that day, as the center wound down and the sun dipped, low over the treetops, Olivia updated the whiteboard in the entryway. She erased the old message. Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener? The Dalton Standard begins here. The Dalton Standard begins here. Be someone's safe place. Saw it on his way out. He didn't stop, but his hand brushed the frame gently like a salute without the motion. He walked into the dusk quietly. Behind him, the center pulsed with life, messy, honest, resilient, and everywhere the message spread. One courtroom, one refusal. One man who stayed seated not out of protest, but because he'd carried too much, for too long. And finally, the world began to understand. It was the kind of morning that felt more like a beginning than a continuation. Cool air curling under doors. Birds calling just a little louder, as if they knew something had changed. The Fort Talbot Wellness Center opened its doors earlier than usual that day. No announcement, no flyers, just instinct. The same way a family wakes early before a funeral or a birth. Inside the center buzzed with quiet movement. Olivia adjusted. The chairs in the main room twice, maybe 3 times. JD stood by the window nursing a cup of black coffee, Boone dozing at his feet. Across the hall, Lena, the visiting counselor from Mason, was pinning new names to the veterans' wall. Shh, she hummed softly, unaware that JD could hear every word. A delivery van pulled into the lot around 9 a.m., not unusual. What was unusual was the driver-on older man with a stiff gait and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He wore no uniform, but JD recognized the bearing. The posture of a man who'd once saluted something bigger than himself. "You, JD Dalton?" the man asked, holding out a small envelope. JD took it with a quiet nod. No return address. Just his name, written in sharp block letters. He opened it carefully, like he already sensed what was inside. A single sheet of paper. No fluff. Just facts. You are formally invited to speak at the Presidential Forum on Veteran Mental Health Initiatives. He read it twice. There was no request for credentials. No reminder of his silver star. No rundown of what he should say. It's just an address. A date. And a line at the bottom. Your voice changed more than policy. It changed people. He folded the letter once, then tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. Olivia saw the movement, caught his eye, but said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply offered him a second cup of coffee. And he accepted without a word. By noon, the center was alive. Veterans filtering in from towns up to 60 miles away. Some drove hours just to sit on the porch. Some brought their dogs. Some brought nothing at all but silence. One man stood at the front desk, gripping the edge like a life raft. "I've never done this," he admitted, eyes down. "Didn't think I'd need to." JD walked over and rested a hand on the desk beside him. "You don't need to need it," he said. "You just need to be here." The man nodded, eyes glassy. And for the first time in years, he took a seat. Without scanning the exits, the rest of the day moved in rhythms that only a place like this could understand. Conversations flowed and paused. Tears came and went. A group gathered on the back lawn to repaint the faded flag mural, brushes steady, in hands that once shook too much to hold forks. One young Marine, barely 22, asked JD if it was true. "About the forum, about the president." "Guess it is," JD said, sipping his coffee. "You gonna go?" JD looked out at the trees. They turned orange too early that year. But he didn't mind. "I think I have too," he said. "Not for me. For the ones who never sat down long enough to be heard." Later that night, when most had gone home and the lights dimmed low, JD stayed behind in the kitchen. Olivia found him rinsing out coffee mugs, his sleeves rolled, hands methodical, like it mattered. "You ever wonder why it was you?" She asked gently, "Why this all happened around you?" He didn't answer right away. "I didn't stand up," he said finally. And somehow that made people listen. She leaned against the doorway, folding her arms. "No," she replied. "You didn't stand, but you didn't back down either." Nodded once, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the forum invitation. "Will you read this before I send it back with a yes?" Olivia took the paper, scanned it, and smiled. "They're expecting a soldier," she said. "I'll give them a man." Outside, the wind stirred, the trees rustled. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. But inside the center, there was only peace for now. Washington, D.C. was colder than he remembered. Not the kind of cold that bites skin, but the kind that lives in the air, sterile, polished. Diston, Jade, stepped off the shuttle in his pressed civilian suit. Not military issue, but still carrying the weight of service. His shoes were clean, his hands steady, and in his breast pocket. Tucked just behind the invitation to speak was a folded photo. Boone curled at the foot of the Fort Talbot Center fireplace, a veteran's boot resting nearby. He stood in front of the Capitol's West Wing for a long time before walking in. Cameras had already gathered. Reporters, too. They weren't there for a scandal or a protest. They were there for a story. The kind that reminded people what mattered when headlines forgot. Inside the Forum Hall, rows of seats fanned out like an open palm. Military leaders, VA officials, senators, even a few celebrities lined the front. But JD's eyes went to the third row, left side. Olivia sat there with Lena and Tiffany, who wore a navy dress and her burn scars like armor. Ray McMillan was beside them, in full dress blues. Dunn lay at his feet, calm, unmoving. A living reminder of what brought them here. JD was introduced with formality. A decorated veteran. A former sergeant, a recent face in a national debate. But when he took the stage, he didn't stand behind the podium. He stood beside it, hands free, voice low. "I never meant to be here," he began. "And to be honest, I didn't want to be. I was tased in a courtroom for not standing. I wasn't protesting. I wasn't making a statement. I was frozen." Pause. The room was still. I've sat in sandstorms, firefights, helicopters, shaking with fear. But I've never been as scared as I was that day in a courtroom, surrounded, alone, and unable to move. He looked out at the crowd. Not the officials. The veterans? You call it PTSD. I call it memory without a pause button. This doesn't care about court decorum or patriotic music or standing when told. It just hits. And for years, no one saw that. He reached into his pocket, unfolded a wrinkled paper. "This is the letter that invited me to speak today. It says I helped inspire something called the Dalton Standard, a new measure for trauma-informed protocol in courtrooms. There's going to be a standard in my name. Then let it be this. We stop punishing people for the wounds we ask them to carry." Applause rose, quiet but steady. "I didn't come here with degrees or polished speeches. I came with a story. Mine. And the ones of every man and woman who sat in silence, because their pain didn't show on a medical scan." Another pause. "If you really want to serve veterans, don't give us discounts. Give us dignity. Don't shake our hand on Veterans Day and forget our names the rest of the year. See us. Sit with us. Listen, and maybe, just maybe, let us stay. Seated when we need to." He stepped back. The room was silent, then standing. Not a standing ovation, a standing acknowledgement. Not just for his speech, but for the weight it carried. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the halls emptied, JD found a quiet bench beneath a white-lit tree near the reflecting pool. Boone curled beside him. Ray joined without asking. Olivia, too. No fanfare, just company. "I think Michael would have been proud," Olivia said quietly, pulling her coat tighter. JD looked at the water, then at the Capitol's reflection. "I think he'd be pissed it took this long." She smiled. Sadly, then proud after that. JD chuckled, then nodded. They sat there in silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because for the first time in a long time, The silence didn't hurt. In the end, the story wasn't about the tasing. It wasn't about the courtroom or the cameras or even the reform. It was about a man who stayed seated and a country that finally stood up with him. Legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, bruised, still trying. But when it's built on truth, it lasts.